It is Monday, March 5th, 2018, and this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft with myself, Kenneth Arthur, and Rob Staton coming to you on the Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur iTunes subscription. Perhaps for some of you, get that subscription going if you want to get 3000 NFL Mock Draft and other things. Listen, one of these days, someone's going to step up and they'll say, hey, I could produce your show. Let me help you out, Kenneth. But right now, content is king. So I'm working on getting the content out there. And the content today is NFL Scouting Combine 2018. I mean, me and Rob have been doing this show for, 3 or 4 years. So this must be our third or fourth combine, and we're going to talk about it. And we'll talk about this combine in relation to other combines. We'll talk about the stars and the people whose, stock plummeted this week as a bunch of prospects went to Indianapolis and found out how much they weigh and how tall they are and how fast they are and how high they can jump. And some of those things matter and some of them don't. And we'll talk about that as well. So, Rob, in terms of this combine 2018, what did you go in to the combine thinking was true and come out finding out was not true at all?
There's only really one thing that I think we've learned, Kenny, from this combine, and that is that the safeties, there's perhaps a little bit more depth and a bit more athleticism at the safety position than maybe we discovered before. I've generally thought there's probably going to be about 3 or 4, 5 interesting safeties in this class, and the rest of the class isn't going to be much to write home about. But I think there's a few more interesting prospects than that. I think the way that the safeties performed today outperformed the cornerbacks in the drills was really impressive, and there's definitely 4 or 5 different names that I want to go back and have a look at now after the combine. But apart from that, I think really all we did was confirm what we already knew. There's a lack of legit first-round prospects. I think there's probably about 10 to 15 legit first-rounders in this class, and no new names really emerged from this combine. The greater value is going to be in rounds 2 to 3 compared to round 1. I think that was pretty well established before the combine and now has been confirmed. And I think it's also been confirmed that this is going to be a good draft for interior offensive linemen. It's going to be a good draft for running backs. And there's going to be a few linebackers and quarterbacks that go very early. Not so much good at the top of, the first round, maybe even the second round for cornerbacks, receivers, or offensive tackles, though.
I mean, it sounds like from where you're sitting, if you see 10 to 15 first-round grades and the Seahawks are sitting at pick 18, that means that there's a good probability that as far as Rob was concerned, if Rob was a GM, by the time we got to pick 18, maybe at best 2 to 4 of these guys were left on the board if everything goes as planned. And so if you're in that position, on one hand, it means get this guy while you can, because everyone else after this, you're on the edge maybe of this is the opportunity and a team will be more likely to trade up. And on the other hand, you're saying, well, if everyone's as savvy as Rob and I'm pick 18, well, what am I trading up for? Do you see it being a problem for Seattle to get fair value for a trade down scenario in a year that may be weaker in the first round than most?
Very possible. And it's the only time that a team has traded out from the number 18 overall pick in the last few years was when Eric Reid was taken by San Francisco, and they moved up from 31 to number 18. And all Dallas got in return was a third-round pick. So it wasn't exactly a bounty of picks that they got there to move down 13 spots in the draft. And that might be the same thing again. The Seahawks might be trading into sort of the 26 range. They did a deal with Atlanta last year. Maybe they'll do the same thing again. They might have to move into the later 20s or even the early 30s, and they might only get a third-round pick out of it. And then they have to decide whether or not they want to trade down again to get even more stock in the first 3 rounds. They did that last year, moved back a little bit further and a little bit further again before taking Malik McDowell. And it really depends who they're targeting. They'll have a good idea of who they want to take with their first pick, where they're going to be available. But I think the main thing is for the Seahawks, because they're not going to get, listen, there's some big names in there, and people often ask, what would you do if Vita Vea was there at 18? He's not going to be there at 18. He's going to go probably number 7 to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. His floor is probably going to be number 13. People will ask, what about Derwin James? I think the way that Derwin James performed today, it's pretty unlikely that he's going to be there at number 18. They're generally the 2 players that get talked about a lot at 18 if they fell. Well, if they don't, then you're going to have to look to move down anyway, and then you're going to have to target somebody. And whether that's one of the interior linemen, whether that's Will Hernandez or Isaiah Wynn, whether it's one of the running backs, whether it's a different position, trade down as far as you think you can go to make sure that you get the guy you want. And that might be at 26, might be 30, might be 35. And you've got to just see what you can get out of it, because the sweet spot in this draft is going to be rounds 2 and 3. That's where the value is. And the Seahawks have got to try and find as many picks as possible in rounds 2 and 3.
I mean, if I'm thinking about this from, like, if I'm trying to be as logical and strategic and as, you know, cold-hearted as possible, if I'm John Schneider and Pete Carroll and I'm looking at the ways to make Seattle better in the interim, you know, in 2018, but also long term, I mean, the logical way to do that would be get cheaper, get younger, you know, find players in this draft that will be your starters for the next 5 years. And by the fact that they've already traded away their 2nd and 3rd round picks, don't have comp picks in the 3rd round, you're saying that the best picks may be on day 2. The Seahawks only have 1 pick on day 1. They don't have any picks on day 2. And they really lack even picks in round 4 for making trades up. You know, they got a lot of picks in rounds 5 and 7. And what I'm trying to get at with all this is the other thing that the Seahawks are linked to intrinsically and infinitely right now are trades of Michael Bennett and Richard Sherman and Earl Thomas. And maybe if the Seahawks were pairing a pick with a player or using a player or, you know, trying to move picks around by the way of having players, logically, if you said you can move a player like Michael Bennett and still get a player in the draft or have someone like a Deion Jordan step up, you could technically save some money and get better. But then there's also the risk of getting rid of Pro Bowl players that may have time left, especially if you're Earl Thomas or Richard Sherman. Does the position the Seahawks are in right now give you any sort of inclination to lean one way or another in terms of the trades of these players being talked about, or do you not expect anyone to get traded?
Well, I think there's 3 ways of looking at it. And the first one is that this was a point that was made by someone who used to write for my blog, and I've got a lot of respect for his opinions, called Kip Earlywine. And he made this suggestion, and I kind of think he's got some points here. And that is that maybe what we're experiencing with the Seahawks right now is a repeat of what Pete Carroll had when he was at New England, which is a very much a veteran locker room who just don't respect the message that Pete Carroll and the way that he coaches. They're not buying into it. And maybe that this very experienced veteran team has just tuned out a little bit. You know, a lot of them have been with Pete Carroll for 6, 7, 8 years now. Maybe they would respond to a different type of coaching, and Pete's not going anywhere. So maybe he feels like, I need a younger group of guys, because that's when he's had his success. When he went to USC and they churn the players every 3 or 4 years. Obviously, they're college students who are playing for USC there. They responded to Pete. He had a lot of success. He comes to Seattle, builds a very young, hungry team. They have a lot of success, get to 2 Super Bowls. Maybe he feels like he has to go back to that this has to be a younger team now, a younger defense anyway, that are going to take on his message. Perhaps he feels that that's important now. Maybe some of these guys have to move on and they have to get younger. That's just the way of life in the NFL sometimes. Another way of putting it is that the Seahawks spent too much money on their defense in the last few years. They need to balance things out a little bit. It was $93 million, I think, they spent on their defense last year, compared to something like 50-odd million on the offense. There has to be a more even balance moving forward. It's not usual for a team to spend as much on one side of the ball as the Seahawks have been doing. They might want to make some savings there over the next few years and push some of that money onto the offense, especially as the running game has completely collapsed. They maybe feel they need to put a bit more into the offensive line. They've got to prepare for a huge contract for Russell Wilson, which is going to come in the next 2 years. They've maybe got to prepare for some of that. And the other way of looking at it, I guess, is that, you know, you also don't just want to give these players away. So Michael Bennett, what is he worth right now? You know, he's been linked with Atlanta in the last 24 hours. The Falcons may feel if they have Michael Bennett, he is still good enough to maybe push them back to a Super Bowl, and maybe feel like that's worthy of a 3rd, 4th round pick, maybe a flip of picks, maybe somewhere on the line, which enable the Seahawks to move up around from maybe 4 to 3 or from 5 to 3. There could be a deal there, for example, that would help the Seahawks get into the range that they want to be drafting in. But if it was a 6th, 7th round pick, do you really want to just move Michael Bennett for the sake of it? I'm not sure you do. And the same with Earl Thomas. If someone's saying, well, we'll give you a 3rd round pick, they're not going to deal Earl Thomas. If someone says, we'll give you 2 2nd round picks, for example, and there are teams like, I think the Patriots have got 2, the Browns have got 3. I want to say, I think the Jets have got 2 2nd round picks. There's a couple of other teams that have got 2 2nd round picks. if they say we'll give you 2-2s, then maybe they consider it, and then they bring in someone like Jesse Bates the third, who's at Wake Forest, to play free safety, and then they've got another pick to spend on either the offensive line or a running back in round 2. There's lots of different things that they're going to have to consider and manipulate here. So anything could pretty much happen. I can imagine a situation where Earl Thomas signs a new contract in the next couple of weeks. I can imagine. I think Richard Sherman's definitely going to be back with the team next year. I mean, watch the cornerbacks at the combine today, and there's absolutely no way that Richard Sherman's going to get dealt, because they've just created a huge problem for themselves, because there's not going to be a solution in the draft at cornerback. But Bennett and Thomas seem to be the two that are most likely going to be moved.
All right. And just curious, like, who's the last free safety that you can think of in your mind that compared favorably to Earl Thomas?
I can't think of any, but I suppose the other way of looking at it is there are 31 other teams in the league that don't have an Earl Thomas, and some of them even have good defenses. So it'd be horrible to part with Earl. Earl Thomas is the type of player that I think we all assume would just be a Seahawk for life, would go to the Hall of Fame, and would never leave the Seahawks. That he was a core player with Wilson and Wagner at the moment. They're probably the main three. But situations change. There's been a situation where they've re-signed Cam Chancellor and Michael Bennett and maybe regretted those deals down the line. If they feel that it's going to be another one of those situations and they're a little bit wary of that, if they feel they can get some picks, if Earl feels it's maybe time for a change as well, and the right offer is there, then maybe they'll move on. But equally, he's a fantastic player. I could see in the next couple of weeks they're coming to some kind of an agreement to keep Earl, not just in Seattle for 2018, but for the rest of his career. We'll have to see what happens.
And so getting back to this particular combine and the players at the combine and highlighting some of the guys that we people are talking about, today on field goals, I just wrote briefly on Shaquem Griffin, and just sort of, because people want to talk about it. It was the story of the weekend, and it is most closely tied to the Seattle Seahawks because, of course, of his brother Shaquille Griffin already playing here. You saw Pete Carroll. You might have seen Pete Carroll's reaction to Griffin's 40 time and how excited he was at that time. I remember a similar video going around last year, I think with Obi Melifonwu. But this time around, it was Shaquem who runs a 4.38 in his first 40-yard dash, breaking the record for linebackers. And it is just, when people talk about it is a great story, even just not getting invited to the combine. But then I think when you pull out a little bit, it's like, Shaquille wasn't invited to the combine until he petitioned to get an acceptance, just like his brother had to do. And then he was a 3rd round pick. And a lot of guys maybe don't do the combine and are just fine. But we also have to look at it and say, well, there must be reasons that he wasn't invited to the combine that, go beyond just playing at UCF and, not having a left hand and, only being a starter for 2 years. And so I guess just, Rob, when you looked at the tape, when you just look at Griffin as a prospect, even after running a 4.38 or especially after running a 4.38, what do you see? Like, what are the things that are going to hold him back or be like, maybe this is the ceiling for Griffin? Or do you see it as, hey, this guy has definitely had to overcome things, but look at the record of what he's done. Every time he's presented with a challenge, he beats it.
I think the first thing that's very important to highlight, and I think the national media didn't do a particularly good job of emphasizing this. Shaquem Griffin was asked at the Senior Bowl whether, about the combine. He said, well, I haven't got an invite yet. And people reacted very badly to that and said, oh, it's incredible that he's not been given an invite. Why hasn't he been given an invite? And what people didn't realize is that a very, very small percentage of invites had actually been sent out at that stage. Most of the invites get sent out, I think, after the Senior Bowl. So I'm not exactly sure on the numbers, but I think something like 25-30% of the invites have been sent out at that point. And Shaquem Griffin was always going to get an invite to the combine. There was very little doubt that was going to happen. So I think the fact that he was asked on the spot live on the TV and he said he hadn't been given an invite, I think that's what the situation was. People slightly overreacted to that, and I've seen that dynamic played out on Twitter a lot. This guy nearly didn't get invited to the combine, and yet he's run a 4.38. Shaquem Griffin was always going to be invited to the combine, so that's one important thing to mention there. I think that with Shaquem, and look, I love Shaquem. He's obviously a fantastic individual. Love listening to his interviews. If it's a rainy day outside and you want cheering up, just stick on a Shaquem Griffin interview and you immediately feel better about yourself. He's the grittiest player in this draft without a shadow of a doubt. He's also incredibly athletic and talented. And he's going to get drafted. He's going to get drafted probably, I would imagine, in the 3rd or the 4th round type of range. But you also need to have a dose of realism and perspective when you're talking about Shaquem Griffin. And there's no point pretending that these issues don't exist. It's very hard to set the edge against the run when you only have one hand. It just is. And it always is going to be an issue for him. So if you're thinking, well, he could be a full-time linebacker, he's going to have issues defending the run. What he does best, or what he did best at UCF, was to blitz, to get after the quarterback, to play in space, to act as a spy. You see very often he would act as a spy and then chase down the quarterback. Excellent closing speed, made some huge plays as a blitzer off the edge. And that's what I think his role will be ultimately at the next level. You're going to play him as a situational linebacker. You're going to put him on the field in a 3rd and long situation, get him to run after the quarterback, or dropping to coverage there and be able to run around the field. You may well use him in spot duty in early downs as well, but I think more often than not, it's going to be sort of those 3rd downs as an extra linebacker who's obviously got great range, great athleticism and ability to cover and blitz from deep positions. That's what I think he is. And also a fantastic special teams player, and he's going to fly around and do all that for you as well. So yeah, that's what I think he is. But that type of player generally does not go, whether you run a 4.38 or not, at 225 pounds, that type of player often doesn't go very early. So when I see people suggesting you suddenly should go in the 2nd or the 1st round, or even, the 3rd round, you do feel it's a little bit unrealistic and overreacting to what he did at the combine. He's going to be a very inspirational member of a locker room. He's going to be a leader on a team. He is going to galvanize a team, and he's going to be at the heart of a blossoming young program. I'm sure about that. And I could definitely imagine him in Seattle with his brother, creating almost a new personality and identity and core for the Seahawks moving forward. Could definitely see that. But he's going to go in the late 3rd or the 4th round, I think, at best. I don't think he's going to go much higher than that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just to just take away anything other than what we have in front of us in terms of the measurables or his college, record, what he did, his stat sheet, all this kind of stuff, and to get the accolades and to be a quality player for 2 years, and especially to turn around a team, to be a part of a turnaround from 0-12 to 13-0 2 years later, as perhaps the leader of the defense, it is worth noting for sure. But just from a measurable standpoint, I mean, I ran it through the Pro Football Reference combine results, looking for players of similar size and strength and speed. And you could just pull out any number of guys, and there aren't very many 1st-round picks among them. And even within that, the only 1st-round pick was Darren Lee, the linebacker last year. The only 2nd-round pick was Michael Boulware back in 2004 with the Seahawks. And even when you get a lot of the other 2nd-round pick being William Moore, strong safety, who did have a good career with, downplayed by saying little, Atlanta Falcons. But even still, it's like you could go to someone like Chip Vaughn, strong safety, 2009 out of Wake Forest, 6'1", just like Griffin, 221, basically the same size, 4.42, so he was 0.04 seconds slower. But, he had 21 reps on the bench, which was a little bit more than Griffin, one more than Griffin. The broad jump, 125. And that's the other thing. His broad jump was 117 inches for Griffin. It was that's the lowest by 4 inches of anyone else that I could bring in. So athletically, it seems like you're looking at a player who, was a track and field star in high school. So running a 4.38, we know a lot of guys have come into the combine or at their pro day, broken 4.4, broken 4.3, and didn't have, a career to speak of. Chip Vaughn, himself was a 4th-round pick of the Saints and really didn't play. He had 3 games in his whole career. I don't know if that was injury or what it was, because I haven't done that much digging on Chip Vaughn, but it's just, there's a lot of great athletes. That's why you're at this level. That's even why you get to be, playing college football at UCF and being a starter is a huge accomplishment. Not very many guys at the high school level will ever rise up to do something like that. So being an athlete isn't a surprise. As far as, how much, this is sort of just another general question that we've probably hit on many times before, Rob, but just in general, how much more difficult is it to grade someone who comes from the AAC as opposed to someone who comes out of the SEC? When you're looking at Shaquem Griffin, you can look at the incredible performance that UCF and him had individually against Auburn in the Peach Bowl this year. But other than that, you're not getting very many programs in the Big Five in terms of the competition. What do you have to focus on then as a scout when you're looking at a player? What do you focus on in terms when you're watching the tape, knowing that it may not be coming up against the best competition?
Well, it's quite frequent that you have to watch a player who has maybe not played in the SEC, for example, and has played those huge games every single week or most weeks of the season. So it's something you have to take into account. But I think there are enough big games. Shaquem had a really fantastic game against Memphis in the divisional championship game. I think he made one, if not the definitive play at the end of that game. Probably the most memorable celebration post-game as well in the 2017 season was him sort of looking up to the skies and sinking to his knees after making that game-winning play. So, you know, when you see moments like that and you see him impacting big games and you see him against Auburn, as you mentioned there in the bowl game, then, yeah, you know, you definitely get enough evidence, I think, to be able to pass judgment there. And he has some limitations. He definitely has some limitations. I know that he is probably everybody's favorite football player this weekend, and rightly so, given what he's achieved, given the way he's fought through adversity, the fact that he's shown a sensational amount of grit. There's just this incredible personality, and everybody's going to want 32 sets of fan bases are going to want him on their team next year based on what's just happened at the combine. But in terms of is he, and look, I hope he proves what I'm about to say wrong, and I hope he becomes a every down starter in the NFL. I would suggest, having seen him play, that is going to be quite unlikely, that he's going to be a situational linebacker and a special teams ace. And those types of players, like I said, whether you run a 4-3-8 or not, generally aren't going to go that high. The benefit of Shaquem is going to be that he's going to add so much to that locker room as well. So that's going to be another plus for him, and teams will seriously consider that too. But you've got to accept what he is, that he is going to be a situational pass rusher. He's not going to be playing Sam or Will for the Seahawks, and he isn't going to be playing as many snaps as Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright have the last few years.
And just to make it abundantly clear, like when Russell Wilson was drafted by the Seahawks in 2012, I think I spent most of that summer just telling people why there wasn't a very good, probability at the other end of the tunnel of Russell Wilson becoming a high quality starter, even if he could be a quality backup, because he had to do something that no one had ever done before. He had to prove that you could be a successful quarterback at 5'10", 5'11", because that hadn't happened before. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, and it doesn't mean that if Griffin goes, let's say Griffin were to go on the second round or the first round or something like that, there would be a lot of people saying, well, that's an overdraft of a player because, for these reasons, I don't know that he's going to be a great professional player, starter, every down player. And then he may just prove you wrong, and so that's just the way that it is with Griffin, as with anyone else. This is just part of the process, and we don't know about any of these guys until they get to the next level. Getting into the cornerbacks, because we know that the Seahawks have Richard Sherman, and we're assuming that they hold on to him. They've got Shaquille, and assuming that they, of course, they're going to hold on to him. And then we'll see what happens with Justin Coleman, Byron Maxwell, so on and so forth. They've got other guys there, but there was thought, of course, about drafting one. And Rob, as you already alluded to, the cornerbacks here did not do a good job at the combine. You've highlighted Louisville's Jair Alexander as an exception, and Alabama's Levi Wallace. But again, these are smaller players. Did anyone else, or did anyone at all at the cornerback position fit the mold for the Seahawks in terms of size, length, and speed?
Yeah, there were players that certainly fit the mold, and there was a number of players who were over 6 foot tall, who have got 32-inch arms or even longer. Some of those names, Carlton Davis at Auburn, people might be familiar with, had a pretty good year for Auburn. Brandon, I always thought it was Fakaisen, but I think Faison is how they were pronouncing it. The combine is at Virginia Tech. Has had some injury history, but has come back and has got a lot of potential. A couple of years ago was very highly rated and was touted as a potential first rounder, could fall into day 3 and be an option there. Holton Hill at Texas, another name that people should be aware of. I think Isaiah Oliver at Colorado is probably going to go a little bit too early. for the Seahawks tastes, but has got the measurables there and has got the size that they would look for. Look really good working out the combine today in terms of his physique. Levi Wallace that you mentioned there and Isaac Yiadom, there's just a flavour of some of the players, but it was a really disappointing day. It was just so flat, Kenny, watching the cornerbacks today. At one point, Deion Sanders in the NFL Network broadcast just remarked, "We're missing the energy givers, the guys who know I am the guy, those alpha players." And that's what you always see with the cornerback classes at the combine. It's like, here the cornerbacks are here, and they've a bit of a swagger to them, and they're ready to show off and get out there and perform and show what they're all about. And then today, when you're watching them, everybody just seemed really shy and retiring. And then when they were going through the drills, they're not really exploding out of the breaks, and the back pedal was slow. Joshua Jackson, who's been touted as a first-round pick, he's the cornerback at Iowa, he false started on 4 separate occasions. On one drill, the coaches made him stop and start the drill again twice, and he did it 4 times in total. Mike Mayock made a comment during the broadcast as well and said he'd never seen a group have to restart a drill as many times as this ever before, and it was not a good thing. And I completely agree. Just watching it, I couldn't believe what I was watching. Just the lack of energy, the lack of spark, the lack of confidence, and the lack of speed. The way that they even ran the 40-yard dashes was really disappointing. It was just a really mediocre cornerback class. And for that reason, the Seahawks might bypass the position altogether. Last year was the cornerback draft with all the many different cornerbacks who were drafted in the early rounds and the great value that you could find all the way through to round 3. And Shaquem Griffin was the player that the Seahawks took and got a good pick there at the end of round 3. This year, it might be a position that you completely ignore. I think they might look at 1 or 2 of the safeties as converts. I think Trey Flowers, 6'3", 200 pounds, 34-inch arms, very long and lean, probably a bit too long and lean for some teams, but the Seahawks might look at him and say, yeah, do you know what? We can work with him and we can turn him into a cornerback. But apart from that, I think you're really looking at people like, Levi Wallace, bit slim, bit thin, maybe needs to add some weight. Holton Hill could be an option there from Texas. But apart from that, not many appealing options. And I just don't think this is a position that the Seahawks are going to fill the boots with in the draft this year.
Well, you did talk about the running back position at Seahawks Draft Blog recently in your latest post, talking about how that would be the position perhaps that the Seahawks may not find 1 but 2 quality players within the draft, even on day 3, because it's just so deep and loaded. And you say that it is maybe the strongest position in this class, and we've been talking about, it's been an interesting ride for running backs from, the Adrian Peterson, Marshawn Lynch days in 2007, which then kind of peaked. And then we had a huge, a crater of first round, second round, especially first round, not going in the first round, not going in the top 15. And then a resurgence in these last couple of years with Ezekiel Elliott, Leonard Fournette, Melvin Gordon, Todd Gurley, up until this year where we're talking about Saquon Barkley as maybe the number 1 overall pick. But after Barkley, it doesn't get worse. After that, it just seems to be, 7 or 8 guys that who could be, the next level, the next wave of running backs in the league, guys to, put your team around and, perhaps even to the benefit of me being someone who says don't take a running back in the first round, you can get some quality starter Pro Bowl level players, it sounds like, on days 2 and 3. And you've talked about Nick Chubb, Kerryon Johnson, Ronald Jones II, Bo Scarborough, and John Kelly as guys that you really could see fitting well with the Seahawks, not to, spoil the lead here. But in terms of the running backs, like which of those guys do they have to get earlier than round 4? And who do you see falling into that round 4 range in terms of fitting with the Seahawks?
Well, I think the names that are going to be gone by sort of the top 75. So by that, you're talking about by the halfway point in round 3. I think the players that will have gone, obviously Saquon Barkley. I think Ronald Jones II will be long gone by then. I think Nick Chubb will go in that range. Kerryon Johnson definitely will do. Darius Geis will do. Royce Freeman will be gone. Sony Michel will be gone. And Rashad Penny will be gone. So I think those 8 players will go in the top 75. That's how good the running back class is this year. So really the Seahawks, if they want to tap into the quality that's there, they're probably going to have to take one in the top 75. And I can imagine lots of different scenarios. So I could imagine them, for example, trading down from 18, maybe once or twice, and spending the first pick on Ronald Jones II or Kerryon Johnson, or to push Nick Chubb, but I think he's perhaps more likely in the second round, but they might just love him. I mean, he is the prototype of what the Seahawks have drafted in the recent years, with the explosive workout and the size and the attitude to running the football. So I'll add him to that list of names as well. But then if they drop back a bit further, you're probably not, as soon as you start getting deep into round 2, or if indeed they manage to acquire some picks and they're looking at late second round instead, the likes of Johnson will be gone by then. Ronald Jones will be gone by then. Chubb might still be there. I think Michelle will probably be gone. But then you're looking at, I think Darius Geis is going to go in round 2. So maybe he's around there, Chubb, Freeman, Penny, you're looking at those guys. And then after that, there's probably a bit of a drop off. You might go a round, or maybe even a round and a half, before you suddenly see another rush on the running back position. And that's when I think your likes of John Kelly, who for me is a 10-touch a game type of guy, third down possibility there as well. Very tenacious, willing to put his helmet in there and block an edge rusher to protect the quarterback, can take a screen 30 yards, can score on screens, can be a passing game factor. But if you needed him 1 week, say that if your lead runner had got an injury or a concussion or something, and you needed him to step up to the plate for a couple of weeks, John Kelly can do that. And Bo Scarborough's this really curious case, because I remember a couple of years ago when we did a podcast, Kenny, we were talking about players, I think for the 2016 season, who could really take a step forward. And we talked about Bo Scarborough right off the bat, saying that he was somebody who could be the next Derrick Henry, or that Alabama were expecting him to sort of follow his lead and then become the main guy. And it never really happened in 2 years as the potential to be the starter then. Damian Harris was the better running back at Alabama last year. And Bo Scarborough then goes to the combine and jumps, I think it was a 40-inch vertical, and does an incredible broad jump. And you just say, listen, what is up with this guy? He's got the size, he's got the explosive traits. For the playoffs in the 2016 season, look how he performed against Washington and then against Clemson. Where was that for the other 20 games that he played in the last 2 years? Why isn't he doing this more consistently? So that's the concern that you have with Bo Scarborough. But in the round 4, round 5 type of range, if he's still there, you take a punt on him. So there are going to be options. I do think the Seahawks do have to take one of these runners in the top 75. It doesn't have to be their first pick. It doesn't have to be in the first round. It doesn't have to be in the early second round. But I do think they have to target one. And I think the ones that they're most likely to go after are Nick Chubb, Kerryon Johnson, and Ronald Jones II early. And then I think later on, like I say, maybe at the start of day 3, that's when you start considering someone like John Kelly and Bo Scarborough. And I would have no problem at all if the Seahawks take 2 running backs in this class. It is a running back draft. There's a lot of talent there. And if they acquire some extra picks, they're going to have plenty of picks to address other positions. I think if you're spending 2 on running backs, which, don't forget, they did that in 2016, was it? In the 2016 draft, they took CJ Prosise and Alex Collins, and I think they took Zach Brooks in round 7 as well. So they took 3 running backs in that draft. I think taking 2 in this class is more likely than not, because the quality is there.
The Seahawks are never too far removed from a talk about the offensive line and how they're going to improve there. And this year is different than previous years because, of course, we're talking about Mike Solari instead of Tom Cable. So it's going to be a new guy bearing the brunt of the blame if this offensive lineman or that offensive lineman doesn't work out for them. And whether that's going to be a project or a guy who's got a good track record at a high school, or, at a high rated school. They've already done that, of course, with Jermaine Afidi. Texas A&M is no joke, or James Carpenter over at Alabama, or it could be a project like a Christian Sicoli or a J.R. Sweezy. But at all times, they are looking for offensive linemen, people who can block for Russell Wilson, keep him upright, and also open holes for these running backs, because last year, of course, it was the worst running team in the NFL. Bad from the offensive line standpoint, bad from the running back standpoint. And we can just see, where's that middle ground where, if you bring back a Chris Carson and he's going to be healthy, or if you draft a Bo Scarborough, or whatever you're going to do at the running back position, that they have a fighting chance. And their tackle positions for Seattle seem well set at the moment, at least, with Dwayne Brown at left tackle and maybe Afidi at right tackle. But it's the guard positions that they need to get better at. So good news from Rob is that the guards in this class look pretty good and the tackles look pretty bad. So if the goal is to get better at guard, there are options there, although it does make the ones that are good perhaps higher up and harder to get your hands on at a certain point. But this class has got Quentin Nelson, who is garnering some top 5, top 10 talk for sure in the draft. And then you've mentioned Will Hernandez, Austin Corbett, Braden Smith, and Wyatt Teller as guys that did good in the combine. But especially with Braden Smith, you talk about how he has the best O-line TEF score since you started doing that, or since you started getting data. Can you talk about how much the needle moved for Braden Smith this week for you, and what you sort of expect for Seattle to do with their need at guard, whether or not that's something that they can do better on to wait until day 3?
Well, Braden Smith has always been known as a really explosive athlete, so it wasn't a huge surprise that he had a great combine. In the big preview that I wrote, I said that he could be one of the big stars of the combine, and I'm a bit surprised that he hasn't got more attention for the way that he performed at the weekend, because he was on Friday rather, he was one of the big stars of the combine. Really performed well, great explosive testing there. I know that some people like to comment on Tef sometimes and maybe misunderstand what we're trying to say here. By saying that he's an explosive athlete, that doesn't mean to say that we think he's a good offensive lineman. It just means that he's a particularly explosive offensive lineman. And it's a bit naive to think that explosive physicality doesn't matter in the trenches. It absolutely does when you've just got two grown men running into each other. Being the more explosive player is what defines people like Aaron Donald. That quickness and explosion is what makes Aaron Donald who he is. He's not a slob who just happens to be particularly skillful at pass rushing. He's an explosive, fantastically explosive athlete who also happens to be really fast. And it's that combination which makes him great. And if you're going to come up against Aaron Donald, it makes sense to put somebody alongside him or across from him who at least is somewhat physically comparable, which is not very easy to find. A lot of these offensive linemen aren't as quick as Aaron Donald, but some of them are as explosive. And Braden Smith had a really solid career at Auburn. I don't think anybody would say that he blew anybody away and he's a Quentin Nelson type of prospect. But I always listed him as a top 50 potential prospect. And I do think he's probably going to go in the 2nd or 3rd round. There aren't many players with his physicality that could go in that range. And as for what the Seahawks are going to do, I think it's quite similar to the running back position, Kenny. What you're going to find is that if we have 8 running backs going in the top 75, then there's going to be a drop and then maybe a restart on the position again in rounds 4 and 5. I think we'll see a more extreme version of that with the interior offensive linemen. So I think what we'll see is, for example, Quentin Nelson's going to go in the top 10 for sure, possibly the top 5. Then you're going to see a bit of a gap before the likes of Isaiah Wynn and Will Hernandez and Billy Price and Frank Ragnow. They're all going to go probably late 1st, early 2nd round. Austin Corbett's probably going to go in the 2nd round. Braden Smith's possibly going to go in the 2nd or the 3rd round. And then you're going to have a big drop. And you're not going to see anybody that's particularly appealing. You're going to be taking players who are explosive, who you want to take a chance on and develop down the line, or maybe have ran particularly well and you think there's some athletic potential there, or you've just seen something in their attitude or on tape that you really like. And people like Wyatt Teller, for example, later in the draft could be an option there. But I think if the Seahawks want to, and I think that's going to be one of the most interesting things about when free agency starts, is we're going to see how the Seahawks are going to plan for this offensive line. They may just feel like they've spent enough picks on the offensive line. They've spent picks on Dwayne Brown, spent picks on Justin Britt, spent picks on Posick and Afedi and Odiambo and others, and they've got George Fant coming back, and Odiambo will come back, and they've drafted some guys there. They might think that Mike Solari can come in, can work with this group, can take them to a new level with a different voice there. They might bring in a veteran to play alongside Dwayne Brown. I don't know how they're going to plan this. I personally would like to see them consider taking an interior offensive lineman quite early, possibly their first pick, because I think that Isaiah Wynn's the second coming of Zach Martin. I think they're very similar, comparable players there. Zach Martin is at Dallas, he used to be at Notre Dame. I think that Will Hernandez is a fantastic talent, was one of the best drill testers at the combine this week. The way they did the kick slide at 320 pounds is incredible. The way that he worked in space. That was the one question mark with him, was how mobile is he? Because he's just a straight line blocker at UTEP. And then you see him working out at the Senior Bowl and now at the combine at a much lighter weight. He's dropped 20 pounds since the Senior Bowl. And you think, wow, who is this guy? He just looks tremendous. He's powerful. He's explosive. He tested well in TEF as well. And you've just got 2 great options there with Hernandez and with Wynn. You've got Billy Price, who obviously hurt himself in the bench press, but is a very, very, very talented interior offensive lineman. And you've got Frank Ragnow. If you drop down a little bit, you could maybe consider taking someone like that. And there are going to be people who really bang the table for Austin Corbett as well, who some people think he's very similar to Joel Bitonio. I've not studied him enough to make that comparison yet, but I was a big fan of Bitonio. Bitonio was a more explosive and athletic player than Austin Corbett, but a lot of people like him too. So I think if you're going to address the interior offensive line, and if you are going to take a left guard, for example, very early, you're probably going to have to do that in the first 50 picks, and there are some very appealing options there, and I hope the Seahawks consider that.
The Seahawks, there's talk today, as there has been for a while now, of them not bringing back Jimmy Graham and just allowing that relationship to part ways, as I think we could have all expected to happen, both from the Seahawks standpoint and from Jimmy Graham's standpoint. They also have to look at the free agency of Luke Wilson, perhaps leaving them just with Nick Vannett and, Swoops at this moment. And a lot of people wondering, well, what could be next for the tight end position? And will they be able to draft a guy that is able to play that position? Because, that's a lot of red zone targets for Jimmy Graham, and he was very successful there. And if it's not Jimmy Graham, or, what's it going to be? If they're also losing Paul Richardson, what's it going to be? How are they going to get those targets? How are they going to now distribute and spread their offense around through the passing game if they don't have, Jimmy Graham, who, for all intents and purposes was the most important player on the field when he was on the field, even if it was predictable. He is the weapon that Russell Wilson's more important, but he is the weapon. He is the guy that either is getting the throw or is hopefully taking the defense's attention away during the throw. This year's combine, if you look at last year's combine, 2017, there were 7 tight ends who ran a sub 4.67 40-yard dash. And why do I point out that number? Well, David Njoku ran a 4.64 and he got drafted. And of the 6 who were faster than him, 5 got drafted. The exception being Daryl Daniels from the University of Washington, who ran a 4.55. But didn't test that well in other drills, including the broad jump where he had 116 inches. So after that, and people who were slower than David Njoku, only 2 got drafted. Jeremy Sprinkle, who ran a 4.69 and had some other things that teams liked about him. He went in the 5th round. And Michael Roberts, who was the biggest tight end, ran a 4.86, but he was 270 pounds. He got drafted in the 4th round by the Detroit Lions. This year at the Combine, the only tight ends to run a faster than a 4.67 were Mike Gesicki and Jalen Samuels. And Jalen Samuels, I don't know if he's a tight end. He's 5'11", so I'm not so sure that there's a tight end there for Jalen Samuels. So you've only got Mike Gesicki, who's broken that. So you've already talked about this on SeahawksDraftBlog.com, Rob, but last year's tight end class loaded with athletic wonders. This one, how many tight ends could even get drafted? Is it just going to be this is a year for blocking tight ends, or for, you talked about how the highest drafted tight end might not even be able to block at all. Is that right?
So that again, Kenny, I just missed that last bit there.
That's just that the highest drafted tight end isn't even going to block whatsoever.
Well, that's it. I mean, the problem with Gesicki is he doesn't block, and teams are going to have to. This is, I love the combine, and there is definite value in the combine, Kenny, and I think that is indisputable. Really, there is a lot to be gained, a lot of information to be gained from this, but there's also a bad side to it, and that side is, oh my God, Mike Gesicki ran and he jumped and he did this, and therefore he's going to be in the first round. And it's the same with Shaquem Griffin, unfortunately, and it was with DJ Chark the other day as well. The knee-jerk reactions to good, positive workouts is not one of the better. It's annoying more than anything else. And you see last year, Jordan Willis had a fantastic combine, and everybody talked about he was the Kansas State pass rusher. Everybody talked about him potentially going in the first round, and that's where he was going to go now. And that he was the best defensive end who'd run the quickest 10-yard split since Cliff Averill, years and years ago. And that he was definitely going to. And he compared to this guy, and he compared to that, and he compared to Clark Kent, and he all this. And in the end, he went in the 3rd round, which is where everybody said he was going to go before the combine. He was always a 3rd round pick, and he went in the 3rd round. And the same could happen with Mike Gesicki. Teams might just look at Gesicki and say, you know what? He is what he is, which is a big slot receiver, and he ran well and he jumped well. And you put him in the red zone, and he might jump over the guy and high point the football and make you a catch. And he might do what Jimmy Graham did for the Seahawks last year. But do you know what else might happen? he might not be able to win those contested balls against the elite of the elite cornerbacks. And the other team might put a guy on him who is equally big and fast and strong, and he might not be able to separate, or he might not be competing for that ball as well as he should be. Or he's a long strider. This is the other thing to remember. He won't be running in a straight line 40 yards downfield many times like he did at the combine. He's going to have to change direction. He's going to have to run the seam. He's going to have to win with quickness. And he's a long strider. And that, I think it was like a 4.54 or something that he ran is going to quickly turn into a 4.7 when he has to change direction. So, you know, these are the things that you have to consider. Now, there's every chance that he will go in the first round. But O.J. Howard a year ago, people remember this, was a fantastic athlete who was asked to block at Alabama and blocked very well and was pretty much the complete tight end and was one of the best players in the draft last year. And I think he went number 18 overall in the end, or in that kind of a range, wasn't it, to Tampa Bay? So he lasted, a lot of people were saying he could be a top 10 pick, and he lasted into the teens. And then Evan Engram, another very good athlete, and Gesicki's not the kind of athlete, and he's not as fluid, and he's not the pass catching threat that Evan Engram is, went in the 20s. And then when you think about things like that, and Njoku went late in the first round, when you think like that, you just wonder, where does Gesicki go? I mean, it wouldn't be a total shock if someone took him in the late 20s or the 30s, but I wouldn't be surprised if he lasted to the second round or even didn't go in the second round, because yes, he's an exceptional athlete, but teams are going to think about more than that. And some teams will go, wow, he's a fantastic athlete, but yeah, do you know what? I'm not quite convinced that he's going to be the dominant Rob Gronkowski type. So we'll go and draft a different position, and we'll take a tight end later on who can do a little bit more blocking for us. And that's how teams are going to view this. So I would urge a degree of caution to people thinking that Mike Gesicki's suddenly going to go in the first round or even the top 40 or 50 off the back of a great combine. Fantastic combine, could easily go in that range, but I don't think it's a certainty.
And lastly, in regards to the combine groups and positional groups, we've got the defensive line. Last year, you mentioned Malik McDowell. We still don't know if he's got an NFL future, but it could be, maybe they do get Malik McDowell back this year, and it's a unexpected boost, that a new defensive tackle, defensive lineman that they can plug in there, a guy that athletically profiled similar to Mario Williams. So he's a guy that maybe they're going to get next year, maybe not, but they still have to look for pass rushing help, as any team I think really does, to get better next season. That's, for me, the main priority for the Seattle Seahawks is pass rushing help. Guys that can help from the interior or the exterior or the edge. I call it the exterior personally. And that can be, it's not typically going to be a linebacker. Maybe it'll be a Leo, but it'll be an edge rusher. If they're going to move Michael Bennett, clearly it has to come somewhere there. If not, they still have to figure out what's going to happen with Cliff Averill. So edge rushers, for sure. Linebackers, pass rushers, anything that could potentially help them pressure the quarterback, whether it's on the inside or the outside. Rob, was there anything that you came away from excited about in terms of the pass rush in this year's draft, specifically with regards to the Seattle Seahawks being able to add interesting pass rushers on day 3, knowing that it's going to be nigh impossible to do prior to that?
I think it's going to be. It was very difficult to get excited, Kenny, about the options there, and I think it's maybe a little bit encouraging that certain defensive linemen are being released at the moment, and maybe the free agency pool is going to grow. I'm not saying they're going to go after these players, but there's talk about Vinny Curry leaving Philadelphia, and Muhammad Wilkerson's just been released by the Jets, and maybe they're going to have to look at a stopgap or two this year, because I don't think the options are really there in the draft. In terms of the edge rushers, I think it'd really benefit the Seahawks to have a Leo, a proper Leo who can maybe play some Sam as well, but predominantly some genuine speed off the edge. Just somebody that offers something a little bit different. It maybe feels like they've lacked that, especially when Cliff Averill was out. And Cliff's, he's probably not as quick as he was 5 years ago. I think he'd probably admit that. They've really missed that dynamic speed rusher off the edge to complement what else they have. And when you look at this draft class, there's really only Josh Sweat, who might have worked his way into the second round with the way that he tested. And there's only really Harold Landry, who they were the only two players who ran a 1.5 10-yard split. It's possible that Lorenzo Carter did as well. NFL Network, for some reason, didn't show us the 10-yard splits for the linebackers, even though there was a number of Leo candidates. You know, Kamoka Torre, for example, Lorenzo Carter are working out with that group, and yet they didn't show the 10-yard splits. So thanks for that, NFL Network. But, you know, they could potentially join the list as well. But for now, we're going to just stick with Landry and Sweat. So the options there are not particularly great. I don't think that they're going to look at someone like Marcus Davenport. I think he might be off the board by 18 anyway, but I don't think they're going to look at someone like him in the first round. Harold Landry, you know, in another draft, maybe they would consider someone like that. I don't think he had quite the workout. You know, he wasn't Bruce Irvin, for example, in the way that he worked out. So again, perhaps that's a little bit unlikely. What there was, though, and this is the positive thing I would say, is that there were some later round defensive linemen who tested well in some of the tests that the Seahawks seem to focus on. So these are the things that you're talking about with the Seahawks defensive linemen. Historically, since Pete Carroll and John Schneider took over, they've never drafted a defensive lineman with sub 33-inch arms. Doesn't mean that it's never going to happen, but we just have to stress that, well, we're 8 years into a regime now. We know pretty much there's a decent amount of evidence there to suggest what they do and don't like, and they've never drafted someone with sub 33-inch arms. We know that they seem to like a 10-yard split of about 1.6. That seems to be a good range for a defensive lineman who works the interior or is an inside or out rusher. So someone like Michael Bennett, for example. And we also know that short shuttle times are very important as well for those types of players. And when you look at the 1.6 10-yard splits, Taven Bryan did really well, first-round pick. Rasheem Green did really well, first-round pick. Deron Payne did very well, first-round pick. But there were three names as well who might be of interest. Jalen Holmes from Ohio State had a really nice 1.67 10-yard split. Kentavious Street, 1.67 split. Breland Speaks, 1.67 split. All with plus 33-inch arms. Street, 3 technique. Speaks, interior. Jalen Holmes, inside-out rusher. For a point of comparison, Malik McDowell a year ago had a 1.69 split, and that was praised for being a really good time. So they ran quicker than him. They're a little bit lighter, but not much more than Malik McDowell. So they're three names to keep an eye on. I thought Tyquan Lewis did really well in the explosive testing and actually had a projected TEF score of 3.48, which would have made him one of the more explosive players in the draft class. But he was suffering with flu. He picked up flu when he got to the combine, so he didn't do any of the runs or the agility test, but he did the explosive jumps. I don't think he did the bench press or that. He did the broad jump and the vertical, though. And he's another player, could be an inside-out rusher that they like. And then in the other note is with the short shuttle here as well. Just to run through some names there. BJ Hill had a nice short shuttle, 4.53, had a really good Senior Bowl, NC State interior defensive lineman. Could be someone they look at as another option there inside, especially if Sheldon Richardson leaves. Could be a later round pick. Harrison Phillips did a good short shuttle time. I think he might go a little bit too high for the Seahawks. Andrew Brown, later round pick, played his arse off at the combine. Just the bag drills, just threw himself around the field, played with intensity and violence, and just looked really good. And that's how he played. Unfortunately, he can be a bit reckless sometimes, but he had a good Senior Bowl as well. So Andrew Brown at Virginia was a big time recruit as well when he was recruited. So he could be another option there too. And the other name that I want to mention here is Nathan Shepard, who was a smaller school player. He's from Canada. Did great at the Senior Bowl before breaking his hand. He's healed now and worked out at the combine. Ran a 4.53 short shuttle, which is really good. And in the drills was really, really impressive. Quick, sharp, great hands, thumped the pads. I thought that Nathan Shepard was one of the best testers. The only problem is he's got 32 and a bit inch arms, which, you know, we will find out how much that matters for the Seahawks when the draft comes around. But I hope it doesn't disclude him from the Seahawks, because I think he's been one of the big risers and one of the big time small school prospects that have really shone in the offseason so far. I fear that he won't be an option for them, but certainly a player that stood out for me over the last few days.
One other thing that I was curious about, Rob, is you talked about the Cleveland Browns, who have the most interesting, draft position of a team in a very long time, holding picks 1 and 4, in addition to, a lot of picks in rounds 2 and 3. But you talk about Saquon Barkley and Josh Allen, perhaps even if it was a trade-up scenario from 4 to 2, so they could secure the 2 players that they wanted to draft the most. And in regards to Josh Allen, I'm curious 2 things. One, if you were the Cleveland Browns and you knew that you were going to secure the top 2 picks in the draft, would you have any strategy to draft the quarterback before the running back? And 2, what did Josh Allen do for you to become the number 1 quarterback in this class?
Well, the thing is for me, I don't think he would be my number 1 personally. I think it's just it's projecting what the NFL is going to view of him. And when you look at the guy, and I've seen him at the Senior Bowl now and at the Combine, and he's just an incredible physical talent. And there will be NFL coaches that look at him and think, I'd have to be an idiot not to want to work with this. I mean, his mobility at his size is incredible. It's probably better even than Carson Wentz's mobility. His arm, he's got a beautiful throwing motion, and the way that the ball just fires off his arm and gets downfield. Some of the deep throws he was throwing at the Combine. Some of the well, let's stick to the Combine for now. I want to come back to the Senior Bowl in a second. But he was throwing passes at the Combine, and you could see all of the coaches stood behind watching him throw. And they were oohing and ahhing at some of the throws that he was doing there. I mean, he just looked absolutely fantastic. I love the way, and teams will love this as well at the Senior Bowl. He had a pretty disappointing first half performance at the Senior Bowl. And Baker Mayfield, I think, left at halftime and actually left the stadium and went home and didn't even stick around for the game, if memory serves correctly. Josh Allen said to the coaches, put me on that field at the start of the second half. I'm not, that was not good enough. I'm going to come out in the second half and I'm going to show everybody that I'm the best quarterback in this draft. And that's what he did. Just went out and led a couple of scoring drives straight off the bat, throwed it all over the field for a variety of throws, difficult throws, scored a couple of touchdowns, just bossed the game, just took over the game completely. And you just look at that and you think, wow, that's the guy that you want being your quarterback. What a competitor. And you have to balance that off with the fact that he looked pretty terrible at Wyoming for a large part and didn't impress there. Yep, the supporting cast is somewhat of an excuse, but he didn't elevate that team in the way that you would have hoped. But in terms of what you want a quarterback to look like, from everything, arm strength, size, mobility, hand size, the way that he's performed at the Senior Bowl and the Combine, he ticks every single box. And coaches are going to think, I can make this guy a champion. And whether that's just the arrogance of a coach and whether it's misguided and he's going to be a huge flop remains to be seen. But teams are going to gamble on this guy. They're going to take a chance on him. And compared to, there will be a few question marks with Sam Darnold. And, we're not talking about Josh Allen's going to get compared to the other guys. Josh Allen's got his flaws. So Sam Darnold had too many turnovers when he was at USC, has only had really 1 full year as a starter. People are questioning about Josh Rosen's character and his personality. Baker Mayfield's not as big as some of these guys than you'd ideally want, and he's not the athlete that someone like Russell Wilson is either. So is he going to be able to elude these tackles? Is he going to be able to make plays downfield in the way that Russell Wilson is? Possibly not. And then Lamar Jackson, is an incredible athlete, has got great arm talent, but is he the kind of guy that you want to pin your franchise on? So there's question marks with all of these players. And when the coaches sit down and the GMs sit down and say, okay, they turn to their offensive coordinator or their offensive minor head coach and say, who do you want to work with? Who are you going to make a winner? Who gives you the best chance to give us a franchise quarterback? A lot of these coaches are going to say it's Josh Allen. And that's why I think that he's going to end up being possibly the number 1 overall pick, but at the very least, I think he's going to be the number 2 pick. I think the top 2 picks, one way or another, are going to be Saquon Barkley and Josh Allen. And maybe what Cleveland will do is they will try and trade with New York to go from number 4 to number 2 to make sure that they can get both of those guys and feel very happy about it. Cleveland have got a lorry load of picks waiting for them in round 2. I think what have they got? They've got 33, 35, and another pick at the end of round 2. Are they willing to sacrifice one of those picks to move up 2 spots? Would the Giants be happy to do that? Move back to number 4, maybe take Quentin Nelson? Possibly they would. So I think that might be a deal that works for all. If they don't, and then I think it's quite simple. If Cleveland stay at number 1, if they take Josh Allen, New York takes Saquon Barkley. If Cleveland takes Saquon Barkley, New York takes Josh Allen. I think that's the way it's going to play out.
Very interesting, and yeah, that's exciting, and a lot of what will determine the draft or the players that go in the draft in a certain order will be the needs of those teams, and we won't know the needs of those teams until after free agency. Finally, Rob, as the Seahawks prepare to enter in free agency, which begins next Wednesday, March 14th. that'll be when teams can officially, that's when it starts. So, we may get news before then, and we will, in terms of who's going and who's coming. But with the Seahawks, it's Sheldon Richardson, Jimmy Graham, Paul Richardson, and then a host of other players that they have to consider, from Luke Wilson to Luke Jokel to Byron Maxwell. So with all of those being said, like, what is your thoughts? What are your inclinations? What is your gut telling you about the biggest name the Seahawks will keep, the biggest name that they'll lose, and what they're going to find out there in free agency if they go looking out for certain positions like guard or pass rush?
Well, I can honestly say that I have got absolutely no inkling on what they're going to do. I mean, it seems to be the most wide open off season that we've seen in many, many years. So it's going to start with who's traded and who's retained, and that's going to determine everything from here. So I think it's very possible that they'll try and sign a running back just to offer as a hedge. Someone like Carlos Hyde, depending on how much he's going to cost, could be an option there. They have to look at, depending on what happens with Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor, they have to at least have a think about possible safeties, and maybe Eric Reed could be someone they look at, could be at the right kind of price for them, because some owners are not going to want to sign Eric Reed because of the protest stuff. The Seahawks are not going to be concerned by that. They might be able to get a bargain on him at a good age for a year or two just to see if he's going to be part of a future core. They're probably going to have to sign a pass rusher at some point, and I think the receivers, as long as they don't all get franchised, obviously Jarvis Landry's already been franchised, looks like he might be traded, but as long as that doesn't happen to many more of them, then there's going to be some nice options there. Maybe they'll look at someone like Marquise Lee, for example, to come in if they don't sign Paul Richardson. So, those are the things I kind of think of, that people are going to get cut between now and the start of free agency as well, which will open up other options. And, hopefully by that point, we will have some kind of a feeling as to what's going to happen with Cliff Averill and Cam Chancellor as well, because they need to know that. I mean, Cam Chancellor, if he does retire, is going to save the Seahawks a lot of money, but he might not feel like he's got any reason to do that, and he's going to make them make a decision. So we'll see what happens there. Jeremy Lane, you would imagine, is going to get cut at some point before the start of the new league year, to free up some cap space there. So it's going to be wide open. Before we finish, Kenny, I really want to give you some. I hope if people are listening to this, I just want to throw some names out there for people to go and watch, if that's possible, for the post combine, if they want a bit of homework for the week.
Absolutely.
I will very quickly run through some of these names. So if the Seahawks are going to make changes at safety, and obviously Cam Chancellor, it looks like that one is going a certain way, that he's either not going to play again or not play again for the Seahawks. And if Earl Thomas is going, then have a look at Jesse Bates III from Wake Forest, who we talked about earlier. Another player to look at, Terrell Edmonds. I'm really interested to see how teams will view Terrell Edmonds, because he had a better performance than his brother, Tremaine Edmonds. He's about 225 pounds and holds that weight well. And I just wonder, given that he ran in the 4.4s today, an incredibly explosive test, I imagine he's going to have done well in the short shuttle if he actually did the drill. We'll find out those numbers later today. I just wonder if he could be someone that maybe is that hybrid linebacker safety. Do you consider him at strong safety? Do you consider playing him at linebacker, and maybe could provide some versatility there? Have a look at John Kelly at Tennessee amongst all of the other running backs in this class. I think they're going to look for a bigger receiver. Now, one of the things that they've not done one of the things they've done consistently is draft receivers that have run in the 4.4s. There weren't many receivers running in the 4.4s this year, and especially the ones with size, and people like DJ Chark were just going to go a little bit too early for them. But Equanimous, is that it? St. Brown from Notre Dame. It's about 6'4". He's about 215 pounds. He did run in the 4.4. So I just wonder if he's somebody that they will consider at receiver, just to get that big target who can also be a bit dynamic on the outside. And then I think there's a cluster of players that are quite interesting, that a lot of them have got very strong special teams credentials. And we know that the Seahawks value that tremendously. And a lot of them are safety linebacker prospects. And I think this is important, because if you draft linebackers, at best they're going to play Sam. More likely they're going to back up Bobby Wagner, and they're going to back up KJ Wright. They're not going to be starting. So if you're going to carry them on the roster, you want them to be able to do something. And that's where special teams comes in. So you've got someone like Fred Warner, who's a linebacker, who's very athletic, could be a bit of a hybrid as well. Very, very good special teams player. Dorian O'Donnell is just an absolute monster on special teams for Clemson, and is a safety linebacker hybrid. Had a 4.07 short shuttle, which indicates that he's very agile. could have done with running faster, a 4.61 40, but I just wonder if he's somebody, because of that special teams value, because of that versatility. Do you try him at safety in camp? Do you try him at linebacker in camp and have a look at him? But you know he's going to be a special teams dynamo. Do you look at someone like that? Oren Burke's another linebacker who has got great special teams value, who could come in, maybe you work with him, get Ken Norton Jr. working with him, could be someone who starts down the line, has got a lot of potential there. Natrell Jameson, another very dedicated professional, willing to play special teams, could be a backup free safety for you. I think he ran a 4.40 earlier, has got that kind of range that maybe they lack at free safety behind Earl Thomas, or somebody could potentially come and compete to replace him as well. Could be someone they look at there. And Matthew Thomas is another name that I want to mention too. Matthew Thomas has had a bit of a difficult time at Florida State, had some ineligibility issues there, had a parent that died while he was at Florida State, and it did seem to impact his football career. But he came back, was solid for Florida State, tested very well running the 4.5s, had an explosive test as well. Looks like a tenacious player and needs some guidance, certainly needs some coaching, needs to get better in a number of areas. That's why he's going to last to the later rounds, possibly be a priority free agent. But he's somebody who could come in and just be a little diamond in the rough for the Seahawks there. So there's some of the names that I'm going to be watching a lot this week. There's some of the names that could fill out the back end of a Seahawks draft board, who could also be taken in that round 5, round 7 range. And it feels like this has been important for a few years, but it feels really, really important this year that the Seahawks rediscover some of that magic in the third day of the draft, that they're going to find the next group of stars. Whether Earl Thomas, Michael Bennett, Richard Sherman move on or not, they're not getting any younger. They need to find a new group of guys that they can build with. So it's very, very important that they find at least 2 or 3 good players in the third round this year. They've got the picks to do it. I think 3 in round 5 and several in round 7. They may add to that as well over the course of the next few weeks. So it's going to be very important to do that. And I do think there are some appealing defensive options in particular in that third day, and a couple of tight end options as well.
Well, there you have it. That's the 2018 Scouting Combine here, recapped on 3000 NFL mock draft for this year. We will be back many times, perhaps between now and the draft, and certainly at the draft, during the draft, and afterwards. So keep listening for that. You can find Rob on Twitter at Rob Staton, and of course, go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com for some written down recap of what we just talked about. And we will also be back. I'll be back for Seaside Chats or Seahawks Chats with Kenneth Arthur for more talk on the Seahawks with free agency. As I said, coming up next week, starting on Wednesday, the 14th. I'll be back later this week to discuss some free agents with the Seahawks with John Fraley of our own fieldgoals.com. I feel like today I've learned I'm not a good public speaker. So with that being said, subscribe to the show. If you want to help make it keep going on, please donate to Patreon at patreon.com/fieldgoals. Appreciate, the people who have supported us in the past and much recently, as I've had to shill out a little bit more, asking for support in that regard. And we'll be back with more episodes of the show either way. So thanks again for listening. Follow Rob on Twitter. Go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Check out fieldgoals.com. And come back next time for, a brand new episode of this show.